The old man's finger hovered an inch from the young man's face, trembling, not with weakness, but with a fury that had been buried for 40 years and had finally found its target. "You have 37 years left," he said, his voice cracking like dry wood, "and you are spending them like a man who has 300. Ethan Cole froze on the sidewalk outside the pharmacy, a paper bag of instant noodles and energy drinks dangling from his fingers, and for one long moment he could not remember how to breathe. Nobody had spoken to him like that in years. Nobody had looked at him like that either, not with pity, which he had grown used to, but with something sharper, something dangerously close to truth. If you believe people deserve second chances, if you believe an old man's harsh words can sometimes be the kindest thing anyone has ever said to you, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner, because this story is about to show you exactly what it costs to keep running from your own life, and what it takes to finally stop. Ethan was 26 years old, and by every measure that mattered to the people around him, he was already a disappointment. He had graduated with a mechanical engineering degree, interned at respectable firms, and held a real job with a real desk downtown. And then, 3 years ago, he had quit, not fired, not laid off, but one gray Tuesday he woke up and could not make himself put on his shoes. The thought of that office, that desk, those 40 more years, had felt like being buried alive very slowly. He called in sick, then again, then stopped calling at all. Since then, Ethan had lived above a laundromat, paid for by his grandmother's shrinking inheritance. He woke near noon, played video games until his eyes burned, and told himself every night that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow never came. His mother, Carol, had stopped asking about jobs, now only asking carefully if he was eating, if he was sleeping, like she was talking to someone on a ledge. His sister Maya had stopped calling altogether, tired of loving someone determined to disappear. Ethan told himself he was fine. Ambition was a trap, the system was rigged, chasing success was just a hamster wheel. These thoughts fit him like an old, frayed coat, uncomfortable, but familiar enough that taking it off felt scarier than keeping it on. The old man who stopped him had no way of knowing any of this. He was tall despite his stoop, bearded in ash gray, with pale sharp blue eyes that seemed to have spent a lifetime looking closely at things other people avoided. "I've been watching you for 3 days," he said. "Same time, same noodles, same energy drinks, walking with your head down like you're carrying something heavy, except you're carrying nothing at all. That's the tragedy. You're exhausted from carrying nothing." Ethan wanted to walk away, but something in the old man's eyes held him, no cruelty, only grief, as though he were looking through Ethan at some other young man from some other decade. "You don't know anything about me," Ethan said weakly. "I know everything about you," the old man replied. "I was you. 51 years ago, except I had a bottle instead of a phone to hide behind. I wasted 11 years feeling sorry for myself because life hadn't given me what I thought I deserved. When I finally woke up, I was 41, with nothing, no career, no family, no friends who hadn't already given up on me." He studied Ethan's face. "I'm telling you this because 3 days ago, I saw a ghost walking down this street. And I decided that whatever years I have left, I'd spend trying to stop at least one young man from becoming that ghost." He handed Ethan a worn card with a handwritten address. "I own a small workshop 3 blocks from here. I restore old furniture, things people think are too broken to save. I could use an extra pair of hands, if you're not too busy with your very important schedule of noodles and energy drinks." The sarcasm almost made Ethan laugh, and the almost laugh startled him, because he couldn't remember the last time anything had. He took the card. The old man walked away, cane tapping unevenly against the pavement, and Ethan stood there a long time, feeling the faint, uncomfortable stirring of a question he'd spent 3 years avoiding. What if he was right? He didn't go the next day, or the day after. He told himself the old man was probably unhinged. But on the 5th day, telling himself it was only curiosity, he went. The workshop smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, warm and resinous, and something in Ethan's chest loosened slightly. Walter, that was his name, was bent over a broken chair, glasses pushed up on his forehead. He simply nodded, as if he'd expected this all along. Good. Grab that sandpaper. We start with the legs. At first it felt like nothing, an old man's charity project, a way to fill empty afternoons. Walter didn't pry into Ethan's life. He simply taught how to feel the grain of wood before cutting, how to sand in slow, patient strokes, how to spot a weak joint before it broke. Everything about fixing something broken you can learn from furniture, Walter said once. People just don't slow down long enough to look. Ethan began coming every day, telling himself it was only to escape the silence of his apartment. But slowly, the workshop stopped being an escape and became a reason. He liked the honest ache in his hands at day's end, so different from the hollow exhaustion of doing nothing. He liked watching a chair that arrived in 3 broken pieces leave the shop whole again, proof that effort produced something real. 6 weeks in, on a rainy Tuesday, Walter finally told him the rest. They were restoring a rocking chair that had belonged to a young mother who'd died young, leaving behind a husband and an infant daughter. Walter's hands slowed on the wood. I told you I wasted 11 years, he said. I didn't tell you why. I had a son, he said. Michael. 7 years old. I was supposed to pick him up for a weekend visit. I was late, I was always late, because I spent most of my time in bars, drowning a failing marriage in self-pity. His mother finally drove him to my apartment herself, tired of waiting. There was an accident. A driver ran a red light. She survived. Michael did not. The workshop was silent except for rain on the tin roof. I tell you this, Walter continued, not for pity, and not to make you feel guilty for whatever brought you to that street corner. I tell you because for 11 years afterward, I disappeared into a bottle. I told myself I had a right to. And in some sense I did. Grief reshapes you, and no one can demand you rebuild on someone else's schedule. But somewhere in those 11 years, my grief stopped being grief and became an excuse. Pain is honest. Excuse is a slow kind of suicide, dressed up to look like survival. Ethan's throat tightened. He thought of his own reasons, the exhaustion at 23 staring down 40 years of drainage calculations. Those feelings had been real. But he understood now, with painful clarity, that somewhere along the way his honest exhaustion had curdled into exactly the excuse Walter described. What made you stop? Ethan asked. A stranger on the street told me I was wasting my life, Walter said, eyes wet but voice steady. I nearly hit him. That night I sat with a full glass of whiskey for 4 hours without drinking it, because his words wouldn't leave me alone. Around 3 in the morning, I poured it down the sink. It wasn't instant, I relapsed twice more that year. But that was the night the excuse started to die. I decided I owed it to Michael's memory to become a man worth having been his father, even though he'd never know it. He looked at Ethan directly. I'm 79 now. Maybe 5 good years left, if I'm lucky. I fix furniture because it's the only apology I know how to make for those 11 wasted years, proof every day that broken things can still be made whole, even late, even imperfectly. I stopped you on that street corner because I recognized the shape of a young man about to spend 11 years, or 20, on an excuse he's convinced himself is grief. Whether you listened was always your choice. But I wasn't going to let you choose without hearing the truth first. Ethan didn't speak for a long time. Something in him, carefully built over 3 years, began finally to give way. That night he didn't play video games. He sat at a dusty desk he hadn't used in 3 years and wrote, not a resume, just the truth. About the Tuesday he couldn't put on his shoes. About the fear underneath the fear, not that the job was wrong, but that he'd never once tried to find out what was right, because trying meant risking failure, and failure meant confirming the old suspicion that he simply wasn't built for the life other people managed. He wrote until 3 in the morning, and something in his chest loosened for the first time in years. He kept going to the workshop, but he also began doing other things. He called his mother, and when she cried quietly on the phone, he didn't pretend not to notice. He told her he was sorry, that he was trying. He started running badly in the mornings, then less badly. He began exploring, without pressure, a hybrid career combining his old engineering training with hands-on restoration work, something he never could have imagined at that downtown desk. He didn't fix everything overnight. Some nights the couch and the noodles still pulled at him. But the loop was no longer infinite. Other days wove between the gray ones, and slowly they began to outnumber them. 6 months after that first sidewalk encounter, Walter's health began to fail. His steady hand started to shake for reasons that had nothing to do with anger. Ethan did more of the shop's work alone, with Walter directing by voice when his hands no longer could. Ethan never said aloud how much those months meant, but he showed up every single day, made sure Walter ate, and learned to read the old man's silences the way Walter had once taught him to read wood grain. Walter passed away the following spring, in his sleep, with a half-finished chair still on his workbench. Ethan found him, and weeks later finished the chair himself, tears falling freely because there was no one left to hide them from. At the small memorial, Walter had almost no family left. Ethan stood and told the story of a stranger who'd stopped him on a street corner with a raised, trembling finger and a truth no one else had dared to tell him. He kept the workshop open, keeping Walter's weathered hand-painted sign in the window. He began, quietly, to do what Walter had done for him, staying alert for the particular slump of shoulders, the hollowness in a young person's eyes, that mark someone disappearing into their own excuses. He couldn't save everyone. But he understood now that the attempt itself was the point, that a broken life, like a broken chair, doesn't need a perfect fixer, only someone willing to sit with it long enough to see what it might still become. If this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about the years you might be quietly wasting, or the person who once told you a hard truth that turned out to be exactly what you needed, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. This channel, Kindness Corner, exists because I believe stories like Walter's and Ethan's can change the direction of a real life, maybe even yours. And before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments below, because I read every single one. What is the one excuse you've been telling yourself, the one you know, underneath it, isn't really grief or circumstance but has quietly become a way of avoiding your own life? You don't have to share details. Just write it down. Sometimes naming the thing, even to strangers on the internet, is the first untouched glass of whiskey sitting on the counter at 3 in the morning, the beginning of the end of the excuse. Ethan never forgot the words that stopped him on that sidewalk, and he carried them for the rest of his life, not as a wound, but as the sharpest, most necessary kindness a stranger ever gave him. Don't waste your life. Somewhere out there right now is a broken chair with your name on it, waiting patiently to be made whole again. The only question is whether you'll pick up the sandpaper today, or tell yourself, one more time, that tomorrow will be different.